had always enjoyed hiking, but for the most part one stuck to the same well-marked trails near my home. I liked the feeling of being outdoors, the steady rhythm of walking through forest and over rock, the sound of water moving in streams, and the way the air always seemed fresher in the woods than anywhere else. That year I had been telling myself I wanted to push further, test myself on something more difficult than the usual short loops and moderate climbs. I wanted a trail that would take a whole day, one that would push me far enough that I could feel the weight of it the next morning. I wanted something that would remind me how small a person is against the size of the land. I chose a trail system in a national forest that wasn't too far away. I read that it had long stretches where you might not see anyone else all day. That appealed to me. I liked being alone in the woods, and the idea of testing myself in that isolation made it sound even better. I studied maps, looked up elevation gain, checked where water sources were, and made sure I had the right gear. I packed more than I usually carried. A bigger pack with extra water, food that could last me longer than I expected, a headlamp, a knife, a compass, and a printed map. I knew there would be cell service in only a few areas, so I prepared as if I would have none at all. The morning I left, the air was cool but already warming. It was early summer, the kind of day when the air feels heavy but not uncomfortable. The first section of trail was wide and easy, gravel underfoot and enough space for two people to walk side by side. I saw a few other hikers near the start, but once I moved farther in, they thinned out until there was no one but me. I liked that. I could hear the sound of my own boots striking dirt and stone. Birds called above me, and I could smell pine needles crushed under the heat of the sun. The deeper I went, the narrower the trail became. Trees pressed in closer. The forest floor was littered with dead branches, and ferns crowded the edges of the path. Every so often I came to a clearing where sunlight broke through, lighting patches of tall grass and wildflowers. I moved at a steady pace, not rushing. I had planned a long loop, about 15 miles, which would take most of the day. I had left early to give myself plenty of time, but I still wanted to keep moving. As the hours passed, I began to notice how alone I was. I hadn't seen another person for a long time. The trail wound uphill and then dropped into valleys where it was cooler and damp. I could smell the wet earth, and in places I had to cross muddy patches where water seeped from the slope above. My legs were working, and sweat soaked my shirt, but I felt strong. At one point, the trail split into two. My map told me the left fork was the one I wanted, but the signpost there was old, weathered, and hard to read. I hesitated for a moment, then trusted the map and went left. The ground rose steeply, and soon I was climbing a rocky section where I had to place my feet carefully. Roots cut across the path, and I used them like steps. My breathing grew heavier, and my thighs burned. But when I reached the top, the view opened into a ridge. I stopped there to drink from my bottle and eat a snack, looking out at miles of forest stretching into the distance. It was beautiful, but it was also clear just how far I was from anyone. The expanse of trees went on, and I realized that if something happened to me out here, help wouldn't come fast. I tried to push that thought aside. I had done my preparation. I was careful. That was enough. I moved on. The ridge trail narrowed even more. In places it was no wider than the length of my boot, with a steep drop on one side. I slowed, taking each step carefully, making sure my pack didn't throw off my balance. It was steady work, but after a while the trail dropped down again into thick woods. I felt relief being back among the trees. The shadows closed in around me, and the air cooled again. It was in that section that I began to feel something different. At first, it was only a sense that I should move faster, as if my body wanted me to keep going without stopping. I brushed it off as simple nerves, but then I noticed how quiet it had become. Birds were gone. Even the buzzing of insects seemed less than before. The only sound was my own breathing and the crunch of my boots. The woods grew denser, darker. The ground was damp, and moss covered the rocks. The air smelled earthy, almost sour in places where water had collected. I looked around as I walked, trying to shake the feeling, but every direction was the same. Trees close together, shadows, no sign of anyone else. I tightened the straps of my pack and pushed on. I checked my map again at a small clearing. The loop should have curved back by now, but according to the landmarks, I hadn't reached the bend yet. I was farther in than I had thought. I glanced at my watch. It was later than I expected too. I told myself I had enough time, but I needed to keep moving steadily if I wanted to be back before dark. That was when I heard it, a sound off the trail, deeper in the woods. It wasn't an animal sound I recognized. Not a bird, not a squirrel, not a deer. It was something heavier, the sound of brush moving under weight. I froze, listening hard. The sound stopped. I stood there for a full minute, ears straining. Nothing. Finally, I told myself it must have been a deer and started walking again. But the feeling didn't leave me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the trees. Every time the trail bent, I felt like something was just beyond my line of sight. My pace quickened, but I was careful not to let it turn into panic. I focused on the ground in front of me, the rhythm of one foot after the other. Another sound came later, behind me again. This time it was clearer, the snap of a branch under weight. I stopped instantly and turned, heart pounding. Nothing moved among the trees. The woods stood still, silent. I stared so long my eyes watered, but there was nothing to see. I forced myself to turn back and keep walking. My mouth had gone dry. I pulled my water bottle out, but realized my hands were shaking more than they should have been. I drank anyway, then pushed on. The trail finally bent back the way the map said it should, but I realized I was more tired than I had planned. The constant tension of feeling watched had drained me. I needed to slow down, but I didn't want to stop moving. I just wanted to get out of there. The light began to fade faster than I liked. Shadows stretched longer across the ground, and the air cooled again. I knew I had a headlamp in my pack, but I didn't want to use it unless I had to. I needed to save its battery. Then I heard the sound again, closer than before. The heavy rustle of brush. My body reacted before my mind did, breaking into a faster pace. My boots pounded the ground. My breath grew harsh. I forced myself not to run but moved as quickly as I could without tripping. The trail twisted, and every time it bent I imagined something just behind me, following the curve, staying out of sight. At last I reached another small clearing, a place where a fallen tree had opened a gap in the canopy. I stopped there, chest heaving, and looked around. Still nothing, just trees, shadows, silence. But the feeling of being followed was stronger than ever. I pulled out my compass and map, checked my position as best I could, and saw that I still had miles to go before the trailhead. That knowledge sank into me like a weight. I was deep out here, and whatever was following me wasn't giving up. The last stretch of trail became a blur of movement. My legs burned, and sweat stung my eyes. The silence pressed around me, broken only by my own movement. Sometimes I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but when I stopped to listen, they stopped too. That was the worst part. It wasn't just my imagination. Something was pacing me. By the time full darkness fell, I had no choice but to use my headlamp. The beam lit only a narrow cone ahead of me, throwing everything else into deeper shadow. The trees seemed to lean closer in the glow. Every few minutes I turned to shine the light behind me, but it showed nothing except trees and undergrowth. The trail finally widened and began to descend. My legs trembled with each step, but I pushed myself harder, almost jogging now. I couldn't shake the thought that if I slowed down, whatever was behind me would catch up. Then, at last, I saw it, the faint outline of the trailhead sign through the trees. Relief surged through me so strongly I nearly stumbled. I pushed forward, heart racing, and broke out into the gravel lot where my car was parked. The sudden openness of the space felt unreal after hours hemmed in by trees. I didn't stop. I unlocked the car with shaking hands, threw my pack inside, and climbed in. I locked the doors instantly, heart pounding. I sat there for a long moment trying to steady my breathing before starting the engine. As I drove out, headlights cutting through the night, I glanced back once toward the trail. The beam caught only trees, but the feeling that something had been standing just beyond the edge of the light stayed with me. I didn't tell anyone about what happened for a long time. I kept it to myself, trying to convince myself it was nothing more than nerves. my imagination feeding on silence and shadows. I have always loved the outdoors, but this story is one that still makes me feel uneasy whenever I think about it. I decided to take a long solo hike one summer, hoping to clear my head and push myself physically. I had hiked many times before, and while I wasn't an expert, I was confident in my ability to handle myself on a trail. I planned for a 3-day hike into the backcountry, carrying enough food, water, and gear to stay comfortable. I didn't expect anything unusual to happen, but as the trip went on, I found myself in one of the most terrifying situations of my life. The trail started out calm. The sun was shining, the trees swayed gently with the wind, and the air was warm but not unbearable. I carried a backpack that weighed more than I would have liked, but I kept reminding myself that it was better to be overprepared than underprepared. Inside I had food packets, water bottles, a filter, a tent, a sleeping bag, a first aid kit, extra clothes, and a small emergency radio. I wore strong hiking boots and carried a map with a compass. The path ahead of me wound through thick woods, then slowly climbed into the hills. The first few hours went by quickly. My breathing settled into a rhythm, and I felt strong. The forest floor was soft beneath my boots, and every so often I saw squirrels dart across the path. The sound of birds filled the air, and for a while I felt peaceful. I thought to myself that maybe I should do this more often, take longer trips, test my endurance, and maybe even go alone more often. But I had no idea how badly things could turn. By late afternoon, I had hiked several miles in and reached a narrow section of the trail. On my left, the ground dropped steeply into a ravine, while on my right, the slope rose sharply with loose rocks and roots sticking out. The path itself was only about 2 feet wide, and I had to be careful with each step. I slowed down, planted my boots firmly, and kept my body close to the uphill side. My backpack shifted slightly every time I moved, making me nervous about losing balance. As I moved carefully along the narrow stretch, I heard a sound behind me, like rocks shifting. I stopped and looked back, but the path was empty. The forest was still, only the faint rustle of leaves in the distance. I took another step, and again, I thought I heard movement behind me. At first, I brushed it off, thinking maybe it was a squirrel or small animal. Still, it made me feel uneasy. I finally reached a wider section of the trail and stopped to catch my breath. The sun was lowering, casting long shadows across the forest. I checked my watch and realized I should start thinking about where to set up camp for the night. I wanted to be in a safe, flat area before dark. I pushed forward for another hour, scanning the sides of the trail for a clearing big enough for my tent. Eventually, I found a small flat area just off the trail. It wasn't perfect. There were some rocks and roots, but it was good enough. I cleared the space as best I could, pitched my tent, and boiled some water for dinner. By the time I ate, the sky had darkened, and the woods around me grew quiet. I crawled into my tent, zipped the flap shut, and laid down. The first night was mostly peaceful, but at some point, I woke to a faint sound outside. It was like the crunch of footsteps on dried leaves. My heart began to race. I held my breath, listening. The sound came again, slow and deliberate. I told myself it could be an animal, maybe a deer or raccoon, but the weight of it seemed heavier than that. It didn't last long. The sound faded, and after what felt like an hour of listening in silence, I finally drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I unzipped the tent and stepped out cautiously. Nothing looked disturbed. My food was safe, my gear untouched. I tried to shake off the unease and packed up quickly. The trail ahead rose steadily, winding higher into the mountains. The second day was much harder. The climb was steep, my legs burned, and sweat soaked through my shirt. The air grew cooler the higher I went, but the sun still beat down on my back. I stopped often to drink water and catch my breath. Around midday, I paused at a ridge where the trees opened up, giving me a wide view of the valley below. It was beautiful, but as I stood there, I had a strange feeling that I wasn't alone. I turned, scanning the tree line behind me. For just a second, I thought I saw movement, a figure ducking behind a tree. My stomach tightened. I blinked, stared harder, but there was nothing there. Maybe it was my imagination, maybe the light playing tricks on me, I thought. I shook my head and forced myself to keep walking. But as the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. I kept glancing over my shoulder. Every time, the trail was empty, but the sense of eyes on me was strong. The crunch of my own footsteps echoed too loudly in my ears. I walked faster, wanting to reach a safe place before dark. That evening, I found another campsite near a stream. I filled my bottles, cooked a quick meal, and set up the tent. The woods around me were quiet, almost too quiet. I crawled into the tent early, exhausted from the climb, but again I woke during the night. This time, the sound was closer. Leaves rustling, then the snap of a twig. My whole body froze. I stared at the thin fabric of the tent, wishing I could see through it. The sounds circled slowly, moving from one side of the tent to the other. I could hear breathing, slow, steady, human. My mouth went dry. I stayed perfectly still, clutching the small knife I kept near my sleeping bag. The footsteps paused, then drifted away. I stayed awake until dawn, eyes wide open, afraid to move. When daylight finally came, I stepped outside and looked around. There were footprints in the dirt near my tent, boot prints, not animal tracks. They circled around the site and then disappeared back into the woods. My chest tightened. Someone was out here with me. Someone had been watching me. I considered turning back, but the fastest way out was still forward. I folded my tent with shaking hands, packed up, and pushed onward. The trail grew rougher, less maintained. Branches scratched against my arms as I moved. Every sound made me flinch. I walked faster than I should have, nearly tripping several times, but I couldn't shake the fear of someone behind me. By late afternoon, clouds rolled in, dark and heavy. Rain started to fall, first light, then pounding. The trail turned slick, mud pulling at my boots. My backpack grew heavier as water soaked into it. I was cold, wet, and exhausted, but I had to keep going. At one point, as I rounded a bend, I stopped dead. On the trail ahead of me, in the mud, were fresh footprints. They weren't mine. They were heading the same direction I was going. My heart raced. Whoever it was, they were ahead of me now. The storm grew worse, and thunder cracked overhead. I kept moving, but the trail became harder to follow. The footprints appeared and disappeared in the mud, sometimes veering off into the trees. I didn't know if I was chasing them or if they were waiting for me. That night, I couldn't find a safe place to camp. The ground was soaked, the trees dripping. I finally stopped under a cluster of pines, too tired to go further. I didn't bother with the tent. I just wrapped myself in the sleeping bag and tried to rest. But I couldn't. The fear was too strong. The woods creaked and groaned in the wind. I thought I heard whispers, but I knew it was just the storm. Then, sometime after midnight, I opened my eyes and saw a shadow standing among the trees. My body locked. The figure didn't move, just stood there, watching. I grabbed my flashlight with shaking hands and flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Only trees. My chest heaved as I turned the light in every direction. Nothing. The rest of the night passed in a blur of fear and exhaustion. By morning, I was half delirious, running on little food and no sleep. I shoved my things into the backpack and stumbled back onto the trail. My only thought was to get out, get back to safety, no matter how far I had to push. Hours passed. My legs ached. My shoulders screamed under the weight of the pack, but I kept going. Then, as the sun dipped low, I saw it, smoke. A thin line rising in the distance. Someone had a fire. I slowed, crouched low, and crept closer. Through the trees, I saw a small clearing with a makeshift camp. A fire burned low, and beside it was a backpack, a tarp strung between two trees, and a pile of gear. But what made my stomach twist was what I saw hanging from a branch. It was a length of rope, tied into a noose. I backed away, heart pounding. My boots snapped a twig, and I froze. From the shadows of the camp, someone stood up. They turned slowly, and even from a distance, I could feel their eyes lock onto me. I didn't wait. I turned and ran. Branches whipped my face. Roots caught at my boots, but I didn't stop. I could hear movement behind me. Fast, heavy. I sprinted blindly, not caring if I followed the trail, only that I put distance between myself and that clear. I had been planning the hike for weeks. I had gone through maps again and again, marked the trail in different colors, and told myself I would be fine because it was only supposed to be a long day hike, nothing more. I had done plenty of hikes before, but most of them were easy ones on well-worn trails close to town. This time, I wanted something harder, something that would push me a little. I wanted to go somewhere with real mountains, where the air was thin, where the ground dropped off steeply, and where I would feel like I had actually earned the view at the top. The trail I picked was in a part of the range people sometimes called the Lost Ridge. It had a bad reputation for being overgrown and not marked very well, but that was exactly why it interested me. I figured if I brought enough supplies and took my time, it would be fine. It wasn't supposed to be more than 15 miles round trip. A long day, but still manageable. I packed light but careful. 1 big bottle of water, a filter straw, a small amount of food, a first aid kit, my knife, and a thin jacket. I told myself I wouldn't need more. The morning of the hike started cold. The sun was just rising when I parked at the small pull-off that served as the trailhead. My car was the only one there. The dirt road to get to the trailhead had been rough, bouncing my old car so badly that I had started to wonder if I should even try to drive there. By the time I finally parked, I felt far away from anything familiar. I knew there wouldn't be cell service past a certain point, so I sent one last quick message to a friend saying where I was. The trail started out easy. The air smelled sharp, like pine and wet earth. The forest was quiet, except for birds somewhere high up. My legs felt strong and my pack didn't seem too heavy. The trail dipped and climbed again and again, sometimes narrowing to a strip of dirt between bushes that clawed at my clothes. There were no signs, just a faint line through the undergrowth. I felt excited, like I had made the right choice to come here. For the first few hours, I didn't think about anything except the ground in front of me, the sound of my breathing, and the way the sun crept higher and burned off the cold. The forest grew thicker, and sometimes I had to duck under fallen logs or step carefully over rocks slick with moss. At one point, the trail simply vanished into a patch of brambles, and I had to push through them, scratching my arms badly. When I finally broke through to the other side, the path picked up again, faint but still visible. I told myself this was the kind of hiking I had wanted, wild, not easy. By late morning, I reached the first real climb. It rose steeply along the side of a ridge, the ground loose underfoot. I had to plant my feet carefully, because the dirt slid away when I pressed too hard. My breathing turned ragged, and sweat rolled down my back. The higher I went, the more the trees thinned, until I was climbing through open rock with the forest below me. From up there, I could see rolling hills fading into blue haze. It looked endless. I felt small but alive. When I reached the top of that ridge, I thought I was making good time. I ate a quick snack and drank half my water. That was the first mistake, though I didn't realize it then. I assumed I would find streams ahead to refill with my filter, but I didn't check the map carefully enough. The trail dipped down again into another valley, shaded and damp, but no streams appeared, just thick ferns and gnats swarming around my face. By early afternoon, the sun was beating hard. I was sweating so much my shirt clung to my back. The trail grew confusing. Faint side paths branched off, some looking like animal tracks, some maybe made by old hikers. I tried to follow what seemed most worn, but more than once I realized I had wandered onto a wrong track and had to back up. Cost me time. My legs were starting to feel heavy. I stopped to drink again, but my bottle was almost empty. That was when I realized just how dry the ridge had been. I hadn't crossed a single flowing stream since morning. I tried to push the thought away. The trail steepened again, this time cutting across a slope with loose rocks. I placed my steps carefully, leaning forward, my pack pulling at my shoulders. At one point, a rock slipped under me, and I slid a few feet down before catching myself against a tree root. My heart hammered. I sat there for a while, trying to steady my breathing. For the first time all day, a thought crept in that I didn't want. If I got hurt here, really hurt, nobody would find me fast. I forced myself onward. The forest closed around me again, darker now as the sun lowered. Time had slipped by faster than I realized. It was already late afternoon. I told myself I should turn back soon, but part of me was stubborn. I wanted to reach the high ridge I had seen marked on the map. I wanted that view. That decision was the second mistake. The trail became harder to follow the deeper I went. Sections disappeared under fallen leaves, and others were blocked by trees snapped from storms. I began climbing over dead trunks, scraping my shins raw. I was moving slower and slower. The forest felt oppressive now, closing in from all sides. My mouth was dry, my bottle empty. Finally, I reached a small clearing with a boulder in the center. I climbed it, hoping to get a better sense of where I was. From the top, I could see the ridgeline I had wanted. It was still far ahead, maybe an hour or more. But worse, when I turned around to look back, I realized I couldn't even see where the trail had been. The forest was just a tangle of trees and undergrowth. I had been so focused on moving forward, I hadn't kept track of landmarks. A hollow feeling opened in my stomach. I climbed down and tried to retrace my steps. I walked back the way I thought I had come, but after 10 minutes, nothing looked familiar. I turned again, cutting left, but that only led me into thicker brush. I circled the boulder again, trying another direction, but each attempt ended the same. The trail was gone. I felt heat rising in my face, part panic, part exhaustion. I forced myself to stop. I knew from reading that the worst thing was to wander blindly, wasting energy. I tried to stay calm. I still had some food, and I had my filter if I could find water. If I stayed put, maybe I could find my way in the morning. But as the sun began to sink, the forest grew colder and darker. Shadows stretched across the ground, twisting between the trees. I felt exposed. Every sound seemed louder. The snap of twigs, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of something I couldn't see. I tried to build a small place to rest near the boulder. I gathered dry sticks and leaves to make a kind of bedding. I had no tent, only my jacket, but I pulled it tight and sat against the rock. Hunger gnawed at me, but thirst was worse. My tongue felt thick, my lips cracked. Night fell fast. The forest became black, the kind of black where even your own hands disappear in front of your face. I could hear animals moving, though I couldn't tell how close. A branch snapped sharply nearby, and I froze. Something moved through the brush, slow and heavy. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would give me away. Then it faded, whatever it was, but I couldn't relax again. I didn't sleep much. Every time my eyes closed, a new sound snapped them open. My body ached from sitting on hard ground. The cold seeped through my jacket until my teeth chattered. Hours dragged by until finally, faint light started to seep back through the trees. At dawn, I stood and tried again to find the trail. I circled wider around the boulder this time, pushing through thick brush. My legs were covered in scratches now, my arms bleeding in places where thorns caught me. I was weaker than the day before, my head pounding from dehydration. I searched for water constantly, but every hollow I checked was dry, every rock bed empty. By midday, my steps were shaky, my vision blurred. I kept thinking I saw the trail only to realize it was just another patch of flattened grass or animal track. I tried climbing higher ground, hoping to spot something, but all I saw were endless ridges, rolling out into the horizon. That was when the fear truly set in. It wasn't just being lost. It was the weight of how big the place was, how easy it would be for me to vanish in it. The second night was worse than the first. I was too weak to gather much cover, so I huddled against a tree, shivering, my stomach cramped from hunger. My head throbbed so badly I couldn't think straight. I kept licking my lips, wishing for even a drop of water. At some point, I must have drifted into half-sleep, because I woke to rustling close by. My eyes snapped open. I could see a shape moving just beyond the tree line, pale in the faint moonlight. It wasn't human, it moved on four legs, low and steady. Coyote, maybe, or something larger. I stayed still, barely breathing. The shape lingered, then slipped back into the trees. I didn't move again for the rest of the night. Morning came slow, and I felt broken. My legs shook as I tried to stand. My throat burned. I stumbled more than walked. My thoughts felt muddled, like I was slipping in and out of myself. I knew I had to find water or I wouldn't last another day. Hours passed. The sun rose higher. My skin felt hot, my vision swimming. Then I had been planning the hike for weeks. The idea came to me during a restless night when I felt trapped by the noise of the city and the pressure of daily life. I wanted a break from people, from traffic, from my phone constantly buzzing. I wanted to disappear into the woods, even if just for a few days, and come back feeling lighter. I had done some smaller hikes before, day hikes and overnight camping trips, but never a multi-day solo hike deep into the wilderness. Something about testing myself against the land made me want to try. I thought it would be a way to reset my head. I picked a trail in a national forest that wasn't too far from where I lived. It stretched for miles through valleys, up ridges, and into places where there were no cabins or towns for long distances. I printed out maps, studied elevation changes, and packed my gear carefully. My backpack carried the usual: tent, sleeping bag, extra clothes, food, water bottles, filter, first aid kit, and a small knife. I also brought a lighter and waterproof matches, though I told myself I might not even need a fire since it was summer and nights would be mild. My plan was to hike 3 days in, set up camp near a remote lake I had seen on the map, and then hike back out. On the first morning, I left my car at the trailhead. The parking lot was mostly empty, just one other car sitting there. I felt excited as I tightened the straps on my pack and stepped onto the dirt trail. The air smelled clean, heavy with pine, and the ground was still damp from rain the night before. The forest closed in quickly, and the sound of the road faded. Soon it was just my boots on the soil, the distant calls of birds, and the hum of insects. The first day went as I had expected. The trail was steep in places, and sweat ran down my back, soaking the straps of my pack. I stopped for water breaks, ate granola bars, and pressed on. The forest shifted as I climbed higher, with thicker trees and cooler air. I saw deer once in the distance, their white tails flashing as they moved through the brush. By late afternoon, I had covered more ground than I thought I would, so I decided to set up camp on a flat clearing just off the trail. I pitched the tent, rolled out my sleeping bag, and cooked a quick meal on my small stove. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, I felt proud of myself. Everything was going smoothly. I sat outside my tent for a while, listening to the sounds of the woods settling into night. Crickets chirped, a breeze rustled the leaves, and for a while I felt the peace I had been searching for. Eventually, I crawled into my tent and drifted off to sleep. The second day began well enough. I woke early, packed up, and continued deeper along the trail. The ground grew rougher with rocks and tree roots, and I had to watch each step. Hours passed as I climbed and descended ridges. My legs ached, but I pushed forward, excited to reach the lake I had seen on the map. By midday, the sun was high and hot, and I felt the sting of sweat in my eyes. It was mid-afternoon when things began to feel different. The trail grew faint in places, and I had to stop and check my map more often. At one point, I realized I had missed a turn. I backtracked until I found the small marker nailed to a tree and corrected my path. It wasn't a big deal at first, but it planted a seed of worry. If I wasn't paying attention, it would be easy to stray too far. Later, as the light shifted and shadows lengthened, I began to feel a subtle unease. The forest seemed quieter. The birds that had been chattering earlier were mostly silent. I kept glancing over my shoulder, though I knew I was alone. My boots crunched on the trail, the only sound breaking the stillness. I told myself I was just tired. When I finally reached the lake near evening, I was exhausted but relieved. The water was calm, ringed by tall trees that blocked much of the remaining light. I set up my tent near the shore and sat for a while, staring at the water. It should have felt peaceful, but something about the silence pressed against me. There were no fish jumping, no insects skimming the surface, just still water and the heavy quiet of the woods. That night was different from the first. As darkness fell, I heard noises in the trees. At first, it was just the occasional snap of a branch, which could have been animals moving about. But then I heard heavier steps, deliberate and slow, somewhere beyond the edge of my camp. I froze, listening, heart hammering in my chest. The steps would come and go, as if something circled the area. I told myself it was probably deer, or maybe a bear moving through. But the longer I listened, the less it felt like that. The steps were too slow, too spaced out, almost cautious. I sat inside my tent, gripping my knife, straining to hear. Hours passed before exhaustion pulled me into a shallow, broken sleep. In the morning, I looked around the camp. The ground near the trees was disturbed, but I couldn't tell what had made the marks. They weren't clear prints, just areas where pine needles had been scuffed away. My stomach sank, but I tried to shake it off. I had 2 more days before I planned to hike back, and I didn't want fear to ruin the trip. I ate a quick breakfast, packed my bag, and decided to explore a ridge above the lake. The climb was harder than I expected, with loose rocks and steep ground. My legs burned as I hauled myself up. When I reached the top, I sat on a boulder to catch my breath. From up there, I could see the valley stretching out, endless forest in every direction. No roads, no houses, no sign of people. The view should have been beautiful, but instead it filled me with dread. If something went wrong, I was completely alone. When I returned to camp later that day, I noticed something that stopped me cold. My tent flap was open. I knew I had zipped it closed. My pack, which I had left leaning against a tree, was tipped over, contents spilled onto the ground. Nothing seemed taken, but food wrappers were scattered. My heart pounded as I scanned the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there watching me. The woods were still. I spent the rest of the day on edge, checking over my shoulder constantly. Every sound made me flinch. As night fell, I debated whether to pack up and start back early, but I knew I couldn't make it far in the dark. I would have to wait until morning. That night was worse than the last. I barely slept, lying awake listening to the forest. Several times I heard movement again, closer than before. At one point I thought I heard breathing just outside the tent. I held my knife tight, hardly daring to move. When I finally drifted into uneasy sleep, I dreamed of footsteps crunching closer and closer until they pressed against my tent walls. The next morning, I didn't waste time. I stuffed everything into my pack, barely bothering to organize. My only thought was to get out as quickly as possible. I retraced my steps along the trail, moving fast despite my aching legs. The forest seemed darker, the trees pressing closer. Hours passed. I kept glancing behind me, sure I would see someone or something following. Once I thought I caught movement through the trees, a shape darting out of sight. My throat felt dry even though I drank from my water bottle constantly. Sometime in the afternoon, I realized I had lost the trail again. I stopped, heart racing, and checked my map. Nothing around me matched. The ground sloped differently, the ridges didn't line up. I must have missed another marker. Panic clawed at me as I tried to backtrack, but every direction looked the same. I pushed forward, hoping to reconnect with the trail. But the deeper I went, the more I knew I was lost. My feet throbbed, my shoulders ached under the weight of the pack, and dread filled me with each step. At one point, I stumbled across a tree with strange carvings in the bark. Not initials or simple scratches, but deep, crude gouges that looked intentional. I stared at them, my stomach twisting. They weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. As daylight faded, I knew I wouldn't find the trail again before night. I set up camp in a small clearing, though every nerve screamed at me not to. I kept the fire small, just enough to give light. Shadows shifted at the edge of the clearing, and my imagination filled them with figures. The forest around me creaked and groaned, and every sound seemed magnified. That night, I didn't sleep at all. The noises returned, closer, circling. Several times I thought I heard something move just beyond the light of the fire. Once, I caught the faint sound of branches snapping, deliberate and slow. My chest tightened until I could hardly breathe. By morning, I was shaking from exhaustion. I shoved everything back into my pack and started moving again, choosing a direction at random. My only goal was to keep moving to find any sign of the main trail. The hours blurred together. My feet blistered, and sweat soaked my clothes. At one point, I nearly collapsed, but fear pushed me forward. Late in the afternoon, I stumbled onto a faint path. It wasn't the main trail, but it was something. I followed it, heart racing with hope. After an hour, the path widened and I recognized it. The same trail I had hiked on my first day. I had been planning the hike for weeks. The idea came to me during a restless night when I felt trapped by the noise of the city and the pressure of daily life. I wanted a break from people, from traffic, from my phone constantly buzzing. I wanted to disappear into the woods, even if just for a few days, and come back feeling lighter. I had done some smaller hikes before, day hikes and overnight camping trips, but never a multi-day solo hike deep into the wilderness. Something about testing myself against the land made me want to try. I thought it would be a way to reset my head. I picked a trail in a national forest that wasn't too far from where I lived. It stretched for miles through valleys, up ridges, and into places where there were no cabins or towns for long distances. I printed out maps, studied elevation changes, and packed my gear carefully. My backpack carried the usual: tent, sleeping bag, extra clothes, food, water bottles, filter, first aid kit, and a small knife. I also brought a lighter and waterproof matches, though I told myself I might not even need a fire since it was summer and nights would be mild. My plan was to hike 3 days in, set up camp near a remote lake I had seen on the map, and then hike back out. On the first morning, I left my car at the trailhead. The parking lot was mostly empty, just one other car sitting there. I felt excited as I tightened the straps on my pack and stepped onto the dirt trail. The air smelled clean, heavy with pine, and the ground was still damp from rain the night before. The forest closed in quickly, and the sound of the road faded. Soon it was just my boots on the soil, the distant calls of birds, and the hum of insects. The first day went as I had expected. The trail was steep in places, and sweat ran down my back, soaking the straps of my pack. I stopped for water breaks, ate granola bars, and pressed on. The forest shifted as I climbed higher, with thicker trees and cooler air. I saw deer once in the distance, their white tails flashing as they moved through the brush. By late afternoon, I had covered more ground than I thought I would, so I decided to set up camp on a flat clearing just off the trail. I pitched the tent, rolled out my sleeping bag, and cooked a quick meal on my small stove. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, I felt proud of myself. Everything was going smoothly. I sat outside my tent for a while, listening to the sounds of the woods settling into night. Crickets chirped, a breeze rustled the leaves, and for a while I felt the peace I had been searching for. Eventually, I crawled into my tent and drifted off to sleep. The second day began well enough. I woke early, packed up, and continued deeper along the trail. The ground grew rougher with rocks and tree roots, and I had to watch each step. Hours passed as I climbed and descended ridges. My legs ached, but I pushed forward, excited to reach the lake I had seen on the map. By midday, the sun was high and hot, and I felt the sting of sweat in my eyes. It was mid-afternoon when things began to feel different. The trail grew faint in places, and I had to stop and check my map more often. At one point, I realized I had missed a turn. I backtracked until I found the small marker nailed to a tree and corrected my path. It wasn't a big deal at first, but it planted a seed of worry. If I wasn't paying attention, it would be easy to stray too far. Later, as the light shifted and shadows lengthened, I began to feel a subtle unease. The forest seemed quieter. The birds that had been chattering earlier were mostly silent. I kept glancing over my shoulder, though I knew I was alone. My boots crunched on the trail, the only sound breaking the stillness. I told myself I was just tired. When I finally reached the lake near evening, I was exhausted but relieved. The water was calm, ringed by tall trees that blocked much of the remaining light. I set up my tent near the shore and sat for a while, staring at the water. It should have felt peaceful, but something about the silence pressed against me. There were no fish jumping, no insects skimming the surface. just still water and the heavy quiet of the woods. That night was different from the first. As darkness fell, I heard noises in the trees. At first, it was just the occasional snap of a branch, which could have been animals moving about. But then I heard heavier steps, deliberate and slow, somewhere beyond the edge of my camp. I froze, listening, heart hammering in my chest. The steps would come and go, as if something circled the area. I told myself it was probably deer, or maybe a bear moving through. But the longer I listened, the less it felt like that. The steps were too slow, too spaced out, almost cautious. I sat inside my tent, gripping my knife, straining to hear. Hours passed before exhaustion pulled me into a shallow, broken sleep. In the morning, I looked around the camp. The ground near the trees was disturbed, but I couldn't tell what had made the marks. They weren't clear prints, just areas where pine needles had been scuffed away. My stomach sank, but I tried to shake it off. I had 2 more days before I planned to hike back, and I didn't want fear to ruin the trip. I ate a quick breakfast, packed my bag, and decided to explore a ridge above the lake. The climb was harder than I expected, with loose rocks and steep ground. My legs burned as I hauled myself up. When I reached the top, I sat on a boulder to catch my breath. From up there, I could see the valley stretching out, endless forest in every direction. No roads, no houses, no sign of people. The view should have been beautiful, but instead it filled me with dread. If something went wrong, I was completely alone. When I returned to camp later that day, I noticed something that stopped me cold. My tent flap was open. I knew I had zipped it closed. My pack, which I had left leaning against a tree, was tipped over, contents spilled onto the ground. Nothing seemed taken, but food wrappers were scattered. My heart pounded as I scanned the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there watching me. The woods were still. I spent the rest of the day on edge, checking over my shoulder constantly. Every sound made me flinch. As night fell, I debated whether to pack up and start back early, but I knew I couldn't make it far in the dark. I would have to wait until morning. That night was worse than the last. I barely slept, lying awake listening to the forest. Several times I heard movement again, closer than before. At one point, I thought I heard breathing just outside the tent. I held my knife tight, hardly daring to move. When I finally drifted into uneasy sleep, I dreamed of footsteps crunching closer and closer until they pressed against my tent walls. The next morning, I didn't waste time. I stuffed everything into my pack, barely bothering to organize. My only thought was to get out as quickly as possible. I retraced my steps along the trail, moving fast despite my aching legs. The forest seemed darker, the trees pressing closer. Hours passed. I kept glancing behind me, sure I would see someone or something following. Once I thought I caught movement through the trees, a shape darting out of sight. My throat felt dry even though I drank from my water bottle constantly. Sometime in the afternoon, I realized I had lost the trail again. I stopped, heart racing, and checked my map. Nothing around me matched. The ground sloped differently, the ridges didn't line up. I must have missed another marker. Panic clawed at me as I tried to backtrack, but every direction looked the same. I pushed forward, hoping to reconnect with the trail. But the deeper I went, the more I knew I was lost. My feet throbbed, my shoulders ached under the weight of the pack, and dread filled me with each step. At one point, I stumbled across a tree with strange carvings in the bark. Not initials or simple scratches, but deep, crude gouges that looked intentional. I stared at them, my stomach twisting. They weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. As daylight faded, I knew I wouldn't find the trail again before night. I set up camp in a small clearing, though every nerve screamed at me not to. I kept the fire small, just enough to give light. Shadows shifted at the edge of the clearing, and my imagination filled them with figures. The forest around me creaked and groaned, and every sound seemed magnified. That night, I didn't sleep at all. The noises returned, closer, circling. Several times I thought I heard something move just beyond the light of the fire. Once, I caught the faint sound of branches snapping, deliberate and slow. My chest tightened until I could hardly breathe. By morning, I was shaking from exhaustion. I shoved everything back into my pack and started moving again, choosing a direction at random. My only goal was to keep moving to find any sign of the main trail. The hours blurred together. My feet blistered, and sweat soaked my clothes. At one point, I nearly collapsed, but fear pushed me forward. Late in the afternoon, I stumbled onto a faint path. It wasn't the main trail, but it was something. I followed it, heart racing with hope. After an hour, the path widened and I recognized it. The same trail I had hiked on my first day. I had always loved hiking alone. There was something about the quiet of the forest, the way the wind moved through the trees, and the smell of wet earth that made me feel alive. I wasn't particularly experienced, but I had enough knowledge to know how to survive if things went wrong. I packed carefully that morning, making sure I had extra water, a map, a compass, and a small first aid kit. I also had a headlamp and a knife, though I hoped I wouldn't need them. My plan was simple. Hike a loop trail in the mountains near my town, a trail that climbed steeply at first and then leveled out along a ridge before looping back down. It was early summer, and the air was cool in the shade, the sun bright in the open areas. The first part of the hike was pleasant, almost idyllic. Birds chirped constantly, and I could hear the distant sound of a stream rushing through a small canyon. I passed a few other hikers on the way up, exchanged nods, and they disappeared down the trail behind me. I moved at a steady pace, stopping occasionally to drink water and take photos of the landscape. The trail started to narrow and steepen, cutting through thick stands of pine and fir. The soil underfoot was loose in places, and small rocks occasionally rolled beneath my boots, reminding me to be careful with each step. About 3 hours in, I reached the ridge. The view opened up to a wide valley, dotted with patches of forest and bright meadows. I took a long break there, sitting on a large boulder and drinking water. The sun was high now, and the wind on the ridge was strong but refreshing. I could see the trail winding ahead along the ridge, a narrow strip of dirt and rock that disappeared behind a cluster of trees. I put on sunscreen and double-checked my backpack before continuing. This part of the trail was trickier. The ridge was uneven, and some parts were barely more than a foot wide with steep drop-offs on either side. I had to move slowly, carefully placing each foot to make sure I didn't slip. I wasn't afraid of heights, but I was acutely aware that a fall here could be fatal. Around mid-afternoon, I noticed a patch of ground that looked recently disturbed, broken branches and deep footprints pressed into the soft soil. They weren't human footprints, at least not entirely. They were elongated and seemed to belong to some large animal. My heart rate picked up, and I glanced around the trees, half expecting to see something watching me. Nothing moved. I told myself it was probably a bear or a large dog, and I continued, keeping my knife within reach. The trail became more overgrown the further I went. Small trees and bushes had begun to encroach on the path, and the rocks were slick from recent rain. I had to hold onto tree roots to steady myself in a few places, my boots slipping slightly with each careful step. That's when I noticed something else. My phone, which I had been keeping in my backpack for emergencies, had no signal. The realization sent a jolt of anxiety through me. I had told myself I was prepared for solitude, but now that isolation felt heavier. The sun started to drop, casting long shadows across the ridge. The wind had picked up, and I could hear it whistling through the trees in a way that sounded almost like voices. I told myself I was being silly, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. I paused to check my map and compass, making sure I was still on the trail. The ridge curved slightly, and I could see the descent in the distance, but it looked farther than I expected. I had underestimated how long this hike would take. I pushed on, but as the sun began to dip lower, I realized I might not make it back to the main trailhead before dark. Panic began to creep in. I considered turning back, but retracing my steps along the ridge with its narrow ledges and slick rocks seemed dangerous. I decided to press forward and hoped the trail would lead me down to safety before nightfall. Half an hour later, I heard the snapping of branches behind me. I froze. The sound was soft but deliberate, like someone or something was moving slowly and carefully, trying not to make too much noise. I waited, straining my eyes in the dimming light. The forest was quiet again. I convinced myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a fox, but the unease didn't leave me. My pace quickened slightly, but I made sure not to run. Running on these rocks could be fatal. The trail turned sharply, and I came to a steep incline covered in loose stones. My boots slipped slightly as I tested each step, careful not to slide. My hands gripped tree trunks and roots as I slowly climbed. About halfway up, I felt a small rock give way under my foot. I caught myself just in time, but it sent a small cascade of stones tumbling down the incline. I waited, heart pounding, to see if anything would respond. Nothing. The sun was nearly gone when I finally reached the top of the incline. My legs ached, and my water was running low. I needed to find a safe place to rest before night fell completely. I spotted a small clearing with a flat area that would be suitable for setting up a temporary camp. I unpacked my emergency blanket and spread it over the ground, sitting down heavily. My hands shook slightly from exhaustion and adrenaline. I ate some energy bars and drank the last of my water. The forest around me grew darker with every passing minute, and the temperature dropped sharply. I wrapped myself in the blanket, trying to stay warm. That night, I barely slept. Every small sound, the rustle of leaves, the snapping of a twig, made me flinch. I kept my knife close and my headlamp within reach. The wind whistled through the trees, and I imagined shadows moving among the trunks. I tried to remind myself that I was safe, that nothing supernatural was out here, only real dangers like animals or falling. Still, the fear was tangible. Morning came slowly. I opened my eyes to a gray light filtering through the trees. I felt stiff and sore but relieved to be alive. I checked my supplies and planned my route back down. The descent was treacherous, with loose stones and steep drops, but daylight made it more manageable. I moved cautiously, testing each foothold and using my hands to steady myself against rocks and roots. About 2 hours into the descent, I stumbled upon what looked like human tracks. They were fresh and deep in the soil. My heart sank. Whoever had made them was not far ahead. I thought about calling out, but the idea of drawing attention to myself seemed dangerous. I decided to move faster, keeping the sounds of my own movement to a minimum. Eventually, I reached a small stream. I filled my water bottle and drank deeply, taking a moment to rest. I scanned the surrounding area carefully. No one was in sight. I followed the stream downhill, knowing it would eventually lead me back to the main trailhead. The sound of running water was reassuring, and the forest seemed less threatening in the daylight. By late morning, I saw the trailhead in the distance. Relief washed over me. My legs were sore, my arms scratched from branches, and my boots caked with mud, but I was safe. I emerged from the forest, blinking in the sunlight. There were a few cars parked at the trailhead, and I realized how long I had been out there. I took a deep breath, feeling a mix of exhaustion and triumph. I reported the strange footprints to the local ranger station, and they confirmed that hikers had spotted the same tracks earlier in the week. They suspected a large, possibly predatory animal had been moving through the area. I had been lucky to avoid any confrontation. The ranger advised me to be extra cautious in the future, to always hike with others when possible, and to carry extra supplies in case of emergency. The experience changed me. I still hiked, but I became far more careful and deliberate. I never underestimated the forest again, and I always respected its dangers. I learned that fear could be managed with preparation, awareness, and patience. The solitude that once felt peaceful now carried a weight of responsibility. I was grateful for my survival, for the ability to navigate through real fear and uncertainty, and for the lessons I had learned in those long, dark hours on the ridge. I had always loved hiking. There was something about the feeling of being out in the wilderness that made the rest of the world fade away. The air smelled cleaner, fresher, almost sweet after the rain. The crunch of leaves under my boots, the distant calls of birds, and the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. All of it made me feel alive in a way I rarely felt in the city. I was used to long trails, steep climbs, and rough terrain. I liked pushing myself, seeing how far I could go without help. But nothing in my years of hiking had prepared me for what happened on that day. and it is a day I will never forget. I had decided to go alone. I liked solitude when I hiked, liked the way it made me focus entirely on the trail and the environment. My plan was simple. I would take a moderately difficult trail in a national forest that was a few hours' drive from my home. The trail was known for its dense woods, some rocky areas, and a small, hidden waterfall at the end that most people didn't bother to find. I packed lightly, just water, some snacks, a first aid kit, my map, a compass, and a small multi-tool. I didn't take a phone because I wanted to fully disconnect. I figured I'd be back before dark anyway. I was careful, methodical, and confident. I thought I knew exactly what I was getting into. The trail started easily enough. The path was clear, wide enough for a single person, and marked with old wooden signs that had faded from years of sun and rain. At first, the forest felt welcoming. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in thin beams, and the air smelled of damp soil and pine. Birds sang above me, squirrels darted from tree to tree, and everything felt normal, safe even. I walked briskly, taking care not to trip on the uneven ground, but also enjoying the rhythmic sound of my boots crunching leaves and twigs. I didn't feel uneasy at all. I felt alive. After about an hour, the trail became steeper. Roots snaked across the path, rocks jutted out at odd angles, and fallen branches blocked the way. I slowed down, paying more attention to every step. The forest grew thicker, darker, and quieter. The birds seemed to vanish. Even the wind that had rustled the leaves moments ago now barely whispered. I paused to drink water and took a moment to enjoy the view. The trail ran along a ridge, and I could see rolling hills covered in dark green trees stretching into the distance. The sight was breathtaking, but the solitude started to press on me. I had been alone for hours, and while I was used to hiking alone, there was something about this section of the forest that felt different. There was a weight to the silence, a feeling that I was being watched. I shrugged it off. I had felt like this before on long hikes, and it usually passed once I kept moving. I continued along the trail, focusing on my footing. After another hour, I reached a part of the trail that descended sharply into a small valley. The trail narrowed, and the trees closed in around me. Moss covered the rocks, and the path was slippery from recent rain. I moved carefully, making sure each step was secure before putting my full weight down. Suddenly, I heard something. At first, it was faint, almost like a whisper, but I realized it was the sound of movement, something crunching leaves off the trail. I froze, listening. It stopped as quickly as it started. My heart raced. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, nothing dangerous. Still, I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, a warning that made me tense my shoulders. I kept walking, faster now, but cautiously. The trail bent sharply, and I saw the small stream that ran through the valley. Water trickled over stones, creating a peaceful, soft noise that helped calm me. I stopped to refill my water bottle, kneeling by the bank. As I did, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were footprints in the mud, human footprints. I froze again, studying them. They were fresh, maybe a few hours old. Not big, not small, but clearly made by a person. I felt my pulse quicken. The trail was remote. Very few people came here, and the ones who did usually stuck to the main paths. I had thought I was alone. Now, I wasn't so sure. I debated what to do. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I also didn't want to panic unnecessarily. I reminded myself that the forest was huge. Whoever had passed here could be miles away by now. I decided to keep going, but I stayed alert, listening and watching carefully. The trail climbed again, winding up through thick trees. I tried to focus on my steps, telling myself I was imagining things, but the sense of being watched didn't go away. In fact, it grew stronger with every step. Shadows between trees seemed to shift just out of the corner of my eye. Every crack of a branch made me startle. Hours passed. I kept moving, checking the map occasionally to make sure I was on track. The waterfall was supposed to be my destination, and I was determined to reach it. By mid-afternoon, I was deep in the forest, far from any main trailhead. The path became rougher, almost overgrown. I had to duck under branches and push through brambles. My arms and legs were scratched, and my boots were muddy, but I could hear the faint sound of water ahead, a hint that the waterfall was near. Relief washed over me. I had made it this far. Then, it happened. I slipped. I didn't just trip. I lost my footing on a wet rock and slid down a short embankment, hitting my shoulder hard on a tree root. Pain shot through me, sharp and immediate. I lay there for a moment, winded and shaken, my shoulder throbbing. I checked myself carefully. Nothing seemed broken, just bruised and scraped. My pride hurt more than anything else. I sat there for a few minutes, breathing, then slowly got to my feet. I knew I had to be careful. One misstep and I could easily break a bone out here, far from help. I steadied myself and continued, slower now, my movements deliberate and cautious. The sound of water grew louder, more distinct. My hope rose. Maybe I could reach the waterfall, rest, and figure out my next move. But as I moved closer, I noticed something else. Another set of footprints, smaller than mine, crisscrossing the trail. They were fresh. Someone had been here recently, maybe even while I was sliding down the embankment. A chill ran through me. I tried to convince myself again that it was nothing, but my instincts screamed otherwise. I picked up a sturdy branch from the ground, holding it loosely in front of me. Better safe than sorry. The waterfall finally came into view. It was beautiful, cascading over a rocky ledge into a clear pool below. The sunlight hit the water, making it sparkle. I wanted to feel relief, but the fear didn't leave me. I took a slow, deep breath, trying to calm myself. I checked the area around the waterfall. There was no one in sight, just the quiet murmur of water and the occasional bird call. I stepped closer to the edge, looking down at the pool. My foot slipped slightly on a wet stone and I caught myself. My hands were trembling and my heart pounded. I realized I had been holding my breath without noticing. I exhaled slowly, trying to steady my nerves. I decided it was time to head back. I didn't linger. The forest, beautiful as it was, no longer felt safe. I retraced my steps, careful not to make any sudden movements, but the feeling of being followed persisted. Every rustle, every snap of a branch made me tense. I checked behind me frequently, seeing nothing, but the fear stayed. I kept my branch ready, moving as quickly as the rough terrain allowed. As I climbed back up the steep ridge, my shoulder ached and my legs were exhausted. I tried to focus on the trail, but my mind kept imagining someone hiding behind trees, waiting. I didn't see anyone, but the fear was real. I finally reached the point where the forest started to thin. Sunlight streamed through, and the air felt lighter. Relief began to replace the dread. I could see the path leading back to the parking area in the distance. I quickened my pace, slipping occasionally on loose rocks, but always catching myself. My boots were caked in mud, my clothes torn in places, my body tired, but I didn't care. I was almost safe. By the time I reached the parking area, I was shaking. My water bottle was nearly empty, my energy spent. I didn't stop to rest. I threw my pack in the back of my car and got inside, locking the doors. I sat there for a long time, catching my breath, feeling the adrenaline slowly leave my system. The forest was behind me, the danger, real or imagined, left far behind. I realized how close I had come to something bad, how easily a misstep or a wrong turn could have ended badly. I told myself I would never underestimate the wilderness again. I would always be alert, always prepared, always careful. I drove home slowly, my body sore and tired, my mind replaying the day. The forest had been beautiful, terrifying, and humbling all at once. I had learned something important. No matter how experienced you are, the wilderness is unpredictable, and danger can be closer. I had been planning the hike for weeks. The idea started simple, just a long weekend away from the noise of everything. A trip into the backcountry where I could test myself, clear my head, and spend days in silence with only the sound of my boots on dirt and the crunch of dry leaves underfoot. I wanted something challenging but not extreme, something that would force me to dig deep but not push me into recklessness. I picked a trail in a remote section of national forest that wasn't well known. It was marked on the map but poorly maintained, one of those routes that the Park Service didn't officially advertise anymore. It cut through a stretch of dense forest, over several ridges, and ended at a remote lake almost no one visited anymore. That lake was the goal, a quiet body of water tucked in the folds of the mountains, unreachable by car, surrounded by nothing but trees and rock. The drive to the trailhead was rough. The forest road was full of potholes, narrow in spots, with branches scratching the sides of my car. I arrived in the late morning, later than I planned, but the air was clear and cool. The sky was pale blue, with a thin layer of white clouds sliding overhead like stretched cotton. I parked in the empty lot, shouldered my pack, and started out. The first stretch of trail was pleasant. The dirt was packed firm, the slope easy, and the forest alive with sound. I heard birds moving high in the branches, the hum of insects, and the faint trickle of water somewhere deeper in the woods. The air smelled sharp and damp, the scent of pine needles and rotting leaves mixing together. My pack pressed heavy on my shoulders at first, but soon my body fell into rhythm and the weight became background. After about 3 hours, the trail grew rougher. Fallen trees blocked the path. Grass and thorn bushes pressed in from the sides. In places, the tread vanished altogether and I had to pick my way carefully, finding where faint footprints had pressed into the soil. I stopped often to check the map, making sure I was still on track. The ridge lines were steep, and climbing them left my legs burning. My shirt clung with sweat, and every sip of water felt like it barely touched the thirst building in me. By late afternoon, I reached the first ridge top and looked out over the valley below. The view was wide and silent. Layers of trees stretched for miles, folding over hills and ridges until they blurred into the hazy line of the horizon. No houses, no roads, nothing but forest. The thought thrilled me, but it also gave me a quiet unease. Out there, I was small, and the forest didn't care whether I made it through or not. I descended the other side and found a flat clearing where I decided to set up camp for the night. The clearing wasn't marked, just a patch of ground where the trees pulled back enough for me to pitch my small tent. I cooked a simple meal on my camp stove, sat in the fading light, and listened to the silence deepen around me. As night came, the air cooled fast, and the forest darkened until it felt like a heavy curtain had been pulled down. I zipped myself into my tent and tried to sleep. That first night wasn't restful. Every sound seemed amplified in the dark. The crack of a branch, the rustle of something in the leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. My body stayed tense, ears straining, heart quickening at each noise. I drifted in and out, never fully letting go. In the morning, stiff and groggy, I broke camp and pressed forward. The trail grew less obvious as I climbed toward the second ridge. My map showed the path cutting along the side of a steep slope before dipping into another valley. But when I reached that section, the tread vanished completely. I checked my compass, checked the landmarks I could see, and picked the direction that looked right. Hours passed, and unease grew in me. The slope I followed seemed endless, the ground loose and unstable underfoot. The forest pressed tight, branches clawing at my arms, the smell of sap and rot clinging thick. When I finally broke through into a small opening, I expected to see the valley I had been aiming for, but instead, I found more ridges, layer after layer of them stretching on. I stopped, pulled out the map, and tried to match the lines to what I saw. Nothing fit. My chest tightened. I told myself I wasn't lost, just off track, but a voice in the back of my mind whispered otherwise. I pressed forward anyway, convinced I'd reconnect with the trail soon. But the forest grew denser. The ground dropped into steep gullies, forcing me to climb down, wade through ankle-deep mud, then haul myself back up the other side. Sweat ran into my eyes. My shirt clung wet against my back. By late afternoon, I was exhausted and still hadn't found the trail again. I set camp in another rough clearing, smaller this time, barely enough room for the tent. As I ate, I noticed my water was running lower than I liked. I had 2 bottles left, plus the filter, but I hadn't passed any reliable streams all day. My tongue felt thick in my mouth, my lips dry. I told myself I'd find water tomorrow. I had to. That night was worse. The noises seemed closer, heavier. Something moved through the brush near my tent, slow and steady. My heart slammed in my chest as I lay frozen, staring at the fabric inches from my face. I gripped my knife handle tight inside the sleeping bag, waiting, listening. After a long stretch, the sound faded. My breath came back ragged, shallow. Morning didn't calm me. My nerves were stretched thin, my body aching. I pushed forward again, determined to find the trail, but the forest seemed endless. The sun rose high, then slid down, shadows growing long again. My map felt useless now. The landmarks didn't match, the ridges blended together, and the compass needle seemed like the only solid truth. I followed north, hoping it would eventually bring me back to the lake or the marked trail. The third night, I ran out of water. My mouth was so dry it hurt to swallow. My muscles cramped, my stomach gnawed empty. I lay in the tent, staring at the dark fabric above me, the air inside hot and stale. Sleep didn't come. Fear pressed down heavy, thicker than the forest around me. The next morning, I left camp early and searched desperately for water. I scrambled down gullies, ears straining for any sound of trickling. At last, I found a narrow stream running weakly through the rocks. Relief rushed through me. I dropped to my knees, filled the filter, and drank until my stomach ached. The water gave me strength, but it didn't erase the fact that I was still lost. My legs trembled as I climbed again. My arms were scratched raw from branches. My pack straps dug trenches into my shoulders. Time blurred, days bleeding together. I marked trees with my knife to keep track, but the forest all looked the same. By the fifth day, I was moving on pure survival. My food was almost gone. My face was sunburnt, my lips cracked and bleeding. I caught myself swaying as I walked, dizzy, my vision tunneling. The forest pressed in close, air heavy with the smell of damp earth. Each step felt harder than the last. I don't remember when I first heard the faint hum, but when I did, I froze. It wasn't a bird or insect. It was mechanical. My heart jumped. I followed the sound, stumbling downhill through brush until I broke into another clearing. At the far end, I saw it. A dirt road, narrow and rutted, cutting through the trees. Relief crashed through me so hard I almost fell. My knees shook. I staggered toward it, then dropped to the ground, sitting on the edge of the road, breathing heavy. I wasn't safe yet, but I was out of the maze of trees. Roads led somewhere. I followed it, step after heavy step, until at last, I saw a small wooden sign nailed to a post. The letters were faded, but they pointed toward a ranger station several miles ahead. I walked until my legs gave out, then pushed again, until the small building appeared between the trees, its roof a miracle of straight lines in the wilderness. When I reached the door, I collapsed against it. I was found, alive, battered, and shaken, but alive. The forest hadn't swallowed me whole, but I knew, sitting there on the steps of the ranger station, that if I had missed that faint hum, if I had turned the wrong way one more time, the forest would have kept me, and no one would have known where to look. I had always loved hiking, always felt a strange comfort in the isolation of the forest. There was something about the rhythm of my steps on the uneven ground, the smell of pine needles and damp earth, and the way the sunlight would filter through the branches that made me feel alive. I wasn't a casual hiker. I planned my trips meticulously. I studied trail maps, checked weather reports, and packed carefully. But even with all that preparation, nothing could have prepared me for what I experienced on that trip. It was early September, and I had decided to tackle a trail I had never hiked before. The trail was in a mountainous region about 3 hours from my home. According to the maps and online reports, it was moderately challenging, with steep sections and narrow paths. I had no plans to rush. This was a solo trip meant for reflection and connection with nature. I packed a heavy backpack, 2 liters of water, energy bars, a first aid kit, a multi-tool, a compass, a map, an extra layer of clothing, a rain jacket, and a flashlight. I wore sturdy boots, long pants, and a breathable shirt. I also brought my phone, though I knew the reception would be spotty at best. I left my itinerary with a friend, telling her exactly which trail I planned to take and when I expected to return. I arrived at the trailhead just after sunrise. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of wet leaves and soil. Birds sang in the canopy, and every now and then, I could hear the distant sound of running water from a stream. I felt a familiar thrill as I stepped onto the trail, my boots crunching against the mixture of dirt and small stones. I had a map in my hand and a rough idea of the path ahead, but I also knew that trails in the mountains could be misleading. Forks could appear where I didn't expect them, and markers could fade or disappear entirely. The first couple of miles were uneventful. I maintained a steady pace, stopping occasionally to adjust my pack or drink water. The trail wound along a steep slope on one side, dropping sharply into a valley below and rising steeply on the other. The sun climbed higher, casting dappled shadows across the path. I paused at a small clearing to catch my breath and eat a granola bar. The view was spectacular, layers of mountains stretching into the distance, the peaks tinged with gold from the morning sun. I felt a sense of peace, a confidence that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. After the clearing, the trail narrowed and became more rugged. Roots twisted across the path, and loose rocks threatened to send me sliding with every step. I had to pay close attention, planting my boots carefully and using my hands to steady myself on the rough terrain. I was exhilarated by the challenge, but I also felt a small nagging unease. It wasn't fear, not yet, just the awareness that the trail was less traveled and more unpredictable than I had anticipated. Around mid-morning, I came across a fork in the trail. According to my map, the right path would take me to a waterfall I wanted to see, while the left path led to a higher ridge with a panoramic view. The map suggested the waterfall path was shorter, but I decided to take the ridge, craving the view. It was a narrow trail, barely wide enough for a single person. One misstep could send me tumbling down the slope. I slowed my pace, gripping rocks and roots for balance. I hadn't gone far when I noticed the trail was changing in a way that concerned me. The markers were few and far between, faded and difficult to see. Some had fallen or been covered by fallen branches. I stopped and double-checked my map. Everything seemed correct, but the terrain didn't look quite like it should. The incline grew steeper, and the path became almost vertical in some sections, requiring careful scrambling over rocks. My legs burned, and my arms were coated in dirt from gripping boulders, but I pressed on. By late morning, I reached a section where the trail disappeared entirely. There were no markers, no visible path, only steep rocks and scattered brush. I knew I should turn back, but part of me was stubborn. I had come so far and didn't want to give up. I decided to carefully climb over the rocks, hoping the trail would reappear. Every step required careful judgment. Loose stones shifted under my weight, and I nearly slipped several times. My heart raced, and I could feel the sweat running down my back. The forest was eerily quiet, the birds and insects gone as if the woods were holding their breath. I reached a small plateau and took a moment to catch my breath. From there, I could see a thin line of a trail in the distance, just barely visible. Relief washed over me. I thought I had found my way again. But as I began to descend toward it, the rocks beneath my boots gave way. I slipped, my hands scraping against jagged stone, and I landed heavily on my side. Pain shot through my ribs and arm. I lay there for a moment, stunned, listening to my own breathing. I had no cell signal, and there was no one around for miles. I forced myself to stand, testing my movements carefully. My ribs hurt, but nothing seemed broken. My left arm was bruised and scraped, but functional. I realized that if I panicked, I could fall again, and this time it might be much worse. So I took deep breaths, steadied myself, and carefully continued down the rocks toward the faint trail. My pace was agonizingly slow, every step calculated. By early afternoon, I finally reconnected with a clearer section of the trail. I sat down on a large rock, exhausted and dirty, and drank some water. My hands were blistered from gripping rocks, my legs shaky from the strain. I looked at the sun, realizing I had underestimated the time it would take to reach the ridge. There was no way I could make it there and back before nightfall. I knew I had to adjust my plan. I decided to find a safer spot to rest for a few hours and then head back down the trail toward the trailhead. I walked slowly, scanning the forest for a place that could serve as a temporary resting spot. Eventually, I found a small flat area beneath a cluster of trees, with some fallen leaves to cushion me. I sat down, leaned my back against a tree, and tried to relax. My ribs ached, my legs trembled, and my whole body was coated in dirt and sweat. I ate an energy bar, drank more water, and took a moment to calm my mind. The forest was quiet, but I felt a constant undercurrent of tension. The realization that I was completely alone in a rugged, unfamiliar environment made every small sound, like a branch snapping or a rustle in the bushes, heighten my awareness. After about an hour of rest, I decided I had to start heading back. The sun was beginning its descent, and the shadows in the forest were growing long. I took my map and compass out, carefully planning my route down. The descent was difficult. Loose soil and rocks made footing treacherous, and my bruised body protested every step. I used my hands frequently to stabilize myself on the rocks and trees. At one point, I misjudged a step and slipped, sliding a few feet down a slope before grabbing a tree root to stop myself. My heart raced, but I was unhurt this time. As the afternoon wore on, the trail twisted through dense forest. Light filtered in thin rays through the canopy, and the temperature began to drop. I noticed the forest growing quieter again, the occasional bird call disappearing. My pace slowed as the forest thickened, and I realized that the trail markers were fading once more. Anxiety crept in. I checked my map constantly, comparing the terrain with my surroundings. Eventually, I spotted a creek on the map that should intersect the trail ahead. I focused on reaching that creek, knowing that it would be a reliable reference point. I followed the faint trail until I heard the sound of running water. Relief hit me, but I stayed cautious. Crossing the creek required careful footing on slippery rocks. I balanced myself, arms outstretched, and inched across. One wrong step and I could have fallen in, soaking myself and making the rest of the hike much more dangerous. Once across, I continued along the trail, which began to widen and become more defined. By late afternoon, I had descended enough to reach a more familiar section of the trail. The incline was gentler, and the path was easier to navigate. My pace quickened, though I remained cautious, aware of the fatigue building in my legs and the soreness in my ribs and arm. Sunlight dappled the forest floor, and I could hear the distant hum of a highway near the trailhead. Encouraged by the signs of civilization, I pressed on. Finally, after hours of grueling hiking, I saw the parking area of the trailhead ahead. Exhaustion hit me in full force, but relief washed over me even more strongly. I reached the car, collapsed into the driver's seat, and sat for several minutes, letting my body recover. My clothes were torn and stained, my boots caked with dirt, and my body ached in every joint. But I was safe, and I had made it. I drove home slowly, my body still tense from the day's ordeal. I thought back on the hike, replaying every moment in detail. I realized that my mistakes, underestimating the trail, not turning back sooner, ignoring subtle signs of danger, could have cost me much more than a few scrapes and I had been planning the hike for months. The trail was known for its remoteness, and the reports I found online mentioned that it was lightly trafficked, meaning it wasn't crowded, but people still knew about it. That appealed to me because I wanted the sense of isolation without complete danger. I had hiked a lot before, usually well prepared, but this one felt different. There was something about the steep elevation gain and the dense forest coverage that made my stomach twist with a mix of excitement and nerves. I started early in the morning, leaving my car parked at the small lot near the trailhead. The air was crisp and cold, the kind of chill that makes your lungs feel like they are stretching just a little wider than usual. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, and the forest ahead was still dark, the trees creating long, uneven shadows on the dirt path. I double-checked my backpack. Water, snacks, first aid kit, flashlight, map, compass, and my phone, which I had charged overnight. I wore my hiking boots tightly laced, my backpack snug but comfortable. Everything felt in place. I told myself this hike was routine, even though my instincts had that little flicker of unease. The first few hours were typical. The path started with a gentle slope, dirt packed firm underfoot, broken occasionally by rocks and tree roots that forced me to step carefully. Birds chirped in the distance, and a small creek ran alongside part of the trail, gurgling quietly as it twisted around moss-covered stones. I felt alive and focused, my body adjusting to the rhythm of walking and breathing steadily. As the morning passed, the trail began to climb sharply. The incline was exhausting, and my legs burned with the strain of each step. I stopped several times to catch my breath, wipe the sweat from my forehead, and drink water. The forest thickened around me. Pine trees towered overhead, their needles forming a soft, almost sponge-like layer on the forest floor. The air was heavier here, richer with the scent of damp wood and earth. Shadows stretched further across the path, creating strange shapes that seemed to move with the wind. I shook my head to clear the tension forming in my shoulders. It was just my imagination, nothing more. Around mid-morning, I reached a small clearing. I paused to sit on a fallen log and eat a granola bar, appreciating the brief moment of sunlight that warmed my skin. From here, the trail would become narrower, winding through dense brush and climbing higher into the hills. I looked at my map, noting that the trail split further ahead. According to the markers, I needed to take the left fork to reach the summit. I packed my snacks and continued, feeling confident but aware that this part of the trail would require more attention. The forest became oppressive. Trees pressed closer together, and the underbrush scratched at my legs despite my long pants. Roots and rocks jutted out unpredictably, forcing me to watch every step. The silence grew heavier, the usual sounds of wildlife becoming sparse. Only the occasional crow or rustle of leaves marked life in this part of the woods. I noticed the temperature had dropped slightly, the cold seeping through my jacket. I adjusted my backpack, checking the straps and making sure nothing had loosened. Hours passed and the path climbed higher. My legs were growing weary, but I forced myself to keep moving. Then I noticed something strange. The trail seemed less maintained. Fallen branches had begun to cover parts of the path, and the markers were harder to find. I paused, looking around. The map indicated I was still on the right track, but the forest around me seemed unfamiliar. The trees were thicker, and I began to notice patterns in the forest that didn't make sense. Certain trees seemed unnaturally spaced, like someone had planted them in a line. My heart rate increased, but I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. By late afternoon, the sun had dipped lower in the sky, and shadows stretched long across the uneven ground. I realized I had underestimated the time it would take to reach the summit. The trail was now almost unrecognizable, covered with leaves and debris. I stopped to check my compass and map again. I was confident I knew my direction, but something in the stillness of the forest unsettled me. The wind shifted, making the trees creak and groan. It sounded almost like voices, but I dismissed it. As I moved forward, I began to notice that the forest was eerily quiet. There were no birds, no rustling animals, just the crunch of my boots on the leaves. The light was fading quickly, and I realized I needed to find a safe place to camp if I didn't want to hike in darkness. I started looking for a clearing or flat area to set up my small tent. The slope was steep, and I had to be careful not to slip. My fingers were cold, stiff from gripping the rocks and roots as I balanced myself. Finally, I found a small clearing just large enough for my tent. I dropped my backpack and set up my shelter, my hands shaking slightly from fatigue and the creeping cold. I gathered some dry leaves and small sticks to start a small fire. The task was harder than I expected. Most of the wood was damp from morning dew, but I managed to get a small flame going. I huddled close, letting the warmth seep into my cold muscles. The forest around me was dark now, shadows forming strange shapes. I forced myself to stay calm, knowing I was safe inside the clearing. Night fell completely, and the sounds of the forest changed. I could hear small animals moving in the underbrush, and the occasional snap of a branch made me flinch. I ate a small dinner from my pack and drank water, trying to stay hydrated. I double-checked my gear, making sure my flashlight had fresh batteries and my knife was within reach. I lay down in my sleeping bag, listening to the forest. Despite my fear, sleep finally claimed me, though it was restless. Every sound made me startle, every shadow seemed to move. I woke before dawn. The air was icy, and frost covered the ground. I packed up my gear quickly, eager to get moving while it was still early. The trail was even more difficult in the dim light. Roots were slick with frost, and rocks were treacherous. I moved slowly, making sure each step was secure. My legs ached, my back was sore, and my hands were raw from gripping my backpack and using it to steady myself. I realized how exposed I truly was, alone in the wilderness. As I climbed, I noticed the forest thinning slightly, revealing a steep ridge ahead. I thought the summit was close. I pressed on, despite the pain in my legs and the cold biting at my face. Then I made a mistake. I stepped on a patch of loose gravel near the edge of the ridge. My foot slipped, and I barely caught myself with my hands on a nearby rock. My heart pounded in my chest. I knew I had to be more careful. Every step from that point was deliberate, slow, and calculated. After what felt like hours, I finally reached a small plateau that offered a view over the surrounding forest. The sun had risen, casting golden light across the landscape. I could see the valley below, trees stretching as far as the eye could see, rivers snaking through the wilderness. I stopped to breathe, feeling the sense of accomplishment wash over me. I was exhausted, sore, and cold, but I had made it. I sat on a large rock, eating a protein bar and sipping water, taking in the beauty around me. The solitude that had once felt threatening now felt peaceful. I knew I had to start my descent, and I felt cautious but prepared. I had learned my lesson about rushing and not paying attention to the terrain. The hike down was still dangerous, but I was alert and careful. I used my trekking poles to stabilize myself, testing each step before committing my weight. The forest seemed less intimidating in the daylight, though I remained aware of my surroundings. Fallen trees, loose rocks, and slippery roots were constant hazards. Midway down, I stumbled upon a small stream. It wasn't on my map, but it offered a chance to refill my water bottle. I knelt beside it, careful not to slip on the rocks, and filled my bottle, taking a few moments to drink and rest. The sound of running water was calming, and I felt my tension ease slightly. I refocused on the trail, continuing carefully. Hours later, I finally reached the part of the trail that was familiar, the section I had passed through early in the morning. Relief surged through me. I still had to navigate a few steep parts, but I knew I could handle it. My muscles were screaming, my knees were sore, and my feet ached, but I was alive. I moved steadily, using all the experience I had gained during the hike. By mid-afternoon, I reached the trailhead where I had started. I collapsed onto a rock near my car, feeling the exhaustion settle deep into my bones. I was dirty, scraped, and tired, but I was filled with a profound sense of relief and accomplishment. I had faced fear, exhaustion, and the unpredictability of the wilderness and had come through it. I packed my gear into my car, took a moment to stretch, and started the drive home. Looking back, the hike had been terrifying in its intensity and isolation. Every moment of doubt, every slip and scrape, and every shadow in the forest had tested me. But I had learned to rely on my skills, my preparation, and my attention to detail. I had survived because I had respected. I had planned the trip for months. It was meant to be a simple escape. A few days alone in the mountains with nothing but the trail beneath my feet and the weight of my pack pressing against my shoulders. I wasn't running away from anything in particular, but I needed the quiet. I wanted the long silences, the air that smelled like pine and dirt, the feeling of walking mile after mile until my legs burned and my chest heaved. The morning I left, the sky was pale gray and still, the kind of morning that feels like it hasn't woken up yet. The gravel parking lot at the trailhead was empty except for my car, and that suited me fine. I tightened the straps on my pack, double-checked the laces on my boots, and started up the path. The first mile was wide and gradual, leading me deeper into the woods. Birds called overhead, their voices sharp against the quiet, and the only other sound was the crunch of my boots on the dirt. The trail I chose stretched for more than 20 miles one way, weaving through valleys, climbing ridges, crossing streams, and eventually leading to a small alpine lake tucked between steep cliffs. My plan was to hike in slowly, take 2 nights to get there, spend a day by the water, and then head back. It sounded simple when I planned it, but as I pushed deeper into the trees, the weight of being alone pressed down harder than my pack. The deeper I went, the more the forest swallowed me. The trail narrowed, roots rose up from the dirt like veins, and thick ferns crowded the edges. The air grew cooler, damper. My phone had already lost service miles ago, but I didn't care. I had brought paper maps, a compass, a small GPS, enough food for 5 days, and a filter for water. I thought I had prepared well. By late afternoon, I had covered close to 8 miles. My shoulders ached, and the straps had dug raw lines into my skin. I found a flat spot a short distance off the trail, a small clearing beneath tall spruce trees. The ground was soft with needles. I set down my pack and stretched my arms until the blood tingled in them. The quiet here was heavy. No distant cars, no voices, no hum of machines. Just the woods pressing close. I pitched my tent slowly, careful with the poles, and then gathered water from a small stream that cut through the rocks nearby. It was so clear I could see pebbles at the bottom. After filtering it, I boiled some noodles on my small stove and sat back against a tree while I ate. The food tasted plain, but out here even the blandest meal felt warm and good. As the sky darkened, the air turned cold enough that I could see my breath. The forest seemed to fold inward with the night. Every sound sharpened, the cracking of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. I crawled into my tent, zipped the door, and pulled my sleeping bag tight around my shoulders. Sleep didn't come easily. The ground was uneven, and every noise outside pressed against my mind. I kept thinking about how far I was from anyone else. How if something happened I wouldn't see help for hours or even days. Eventually I drifted off, but it was a restless sleep. The next morning, the sun filtered through the trees in weak bands of light. I packed up, ate a granola bar, and continued. The trail climbed steadily, the air thinning as I gained elevation. My legs burned, and sweat dripped down my back despite the cool air. Hours passed this way, one step after another, until the trail flattened along a ridge. From here, I could see mountains stretching in every direction, peaks capped with snow, valleys green and deep. It was beautiful, but the beauty felt distant, like something I was only passing through, not part of. By the second evening, I had gone about 15 miles. I stopped near a rocky outcrop that overlooked a narrow valley. The view was wide, but it also left me exposed. I hesitated, then pushed back into the trees where I found a smaller, hidden clearing. Felt safer. I set up camp again, filtered water from a small pool, and ate jerky with some dried fruit. That night, I woke to a noise. It was faint but sharp enough to cut through my sleep. A crack, like something snapping under weight. My eyes opened, and I lay still inside my bag, listening. The forest had gone almost silent. No owls, no wind, nothing. Just the faint creak of trees shifting. I told myself it was probably a deer. There were plenty in these mountains, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the sound had been close. Too close. I stayed awake for a long time, heart pounding, staring at the dark shape of the tent ceiling. Eventually, I dozed off again, but my sleep was broken, filled with half-formed dreams. The next morning, I found prints near the edge of the clearing. Not boots, hooves, large ones. Probably elk, I thought, though I couldn't tell for sure. Still, the sight made me uneasy. They were close, almost circling where my tent had been. I packed quickly and moved on. The trail narrowed again as it dipped into another valley. The air here was cooler, almost damp. Ferns brushed against my legs as I walked, and fallen trees forced me to climb or duck under. By late afternoon, I was tired and sore. I hadn't seen another person since I started, and that emptiness pressed harder each hour. I thought about turning back, but I was close to the lake now, just a few more miles. The climb to the lake was steep, switchbacks cutting up through rocky terrain. My legs shook, and my breathing came in harsh bursts. Finally, after what felt like forever, the trees thinned and I saw the water spread out below cliffs. The lake was still, reflecting the gray sky above it. Snow clung to the higher slopes, and the air here was biting cold. I set up camp near the tree line, not too close to the water but with a clear view of it. It was beautiful in a harsh, lonely way. I boiled water, ate a quick meal, and pulled on every layer I had as the sun set. The cold seeped in fast. That night, I woke again to noise. Not a crack this time, but a steady sound. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving across the rocky ground not far from my tent. My chest tightened. I lay perfectly still, straining to hear. The steps paused, then started again, circling. My hands shook as I reached for the small knife I kept in the side pocket of my pack. The steps grew closer, then stopped. The silence pressed in. I barely breathed. For what felt like hours, I lay frozen, every nerve in my body screaming to move, but I didn't. At some point, exhaustion pulled me under again. In the morning, I unzipped the tent and looked around. The ground was hard and rocky, not good for prints, but I could see where stones had shifted, where something heavy had stepped. I told myself again it could be elk or maybe even a bear, but the way the steps had circled, it didn't feel like an animal. The lake was beautiful in the morning light, but I couldn't enjoy it. I felt watched, even when I saw nothing. I spent the day wandering along the shore, filtering water, eating, trying to calm myself, but every sound made me twitch. By late afternoon, I made the decision to pack up early and start heading back. The plan of staying a full day no longer seemed worth it. The descent was harder than the climb. My knees ached with each step, and the rocks shifted beneath my boots. Clouds gathered overhead, and soon a thin rain began to fall. It soaked into my jacket and ran down my face. The trail grew slick, and more than once I slipped and had to catch myself on branches. By dusk, I was exhausted. I found a small hollow near the trail and set up my tent in the rain. My hands were clumsy with cold. The storm built through the night, wind pressing against the thin walls, rain drumming hard. I barely slept, every gust making me think of footsteps again. The next morning, I pushed hard, wanting distance between me and the lake. The trail twisted through thick woods, the ground muddy and uneven. Around midday, I saw something that froze me where I stood. On the edge of the trail, just ahead, was a boot print. Large, deep in the mud, pointing the same direction I was going. Fresh. I hadn't seen anyone in days, and the parking lot had been empty. My chest tightened. I kept walking, slower now, my eyes darting over the trees. A mile later, I found another, then another. Whoever it was, they were ahead of me, moving in the same direction. The prints were wide apart, like someone was walking quickly. The rain had stopped, but the woods were still dripping. Every sound felt sharp. I kept expecting to see someone around the next bend, but I never did. I pushed hard, nearly running at times, my pack bouncing against me. My throat was dry, and my legs screamed with pain, but fear kept me moving. That night, I didn't set up camp until it was almost too dark to see. I tucked myself into a dense stand of trees, barely enough room for the tent, hidden from the trail. I ate nothing, just drank water and lay still, listening. I thought I heard movement again, but it could have been the trees. The next day, I moved faster than I thought I could. My legs burned, blisters tore open on my heels, but I didn't stop. I had been planning the trip for weeks. Hiking was always something I loved, but I usually kept my trips short, just day hikes or simple overnight campouts not too far from the trailhead. This time I wanted something more challenging, something that would push me out of my comfort zone. I had been looking at maps for days, marking different trails, checking distances, checking water sources, reading about terrain and elevation gain. I finally settled on a route through a range of hills and ridges about 3 hours from where I lived. The loop was around 25 miles, most of it along narrow ridges and deep valleys, with a few steep climbs and descents. Most people didn't hike it in one go, but I thought I could manage it over 2 days. I packed my gear carefully: tent, sleeping bag, stove, food, water filter, first aid kit, and everything else I thought I would need. I woke up early, drove to the trailhead, and parked my car in a small gravel lot surrounded by trees. The air was cool, and the sun had only just started to come up. I strapped on my pack, locked the car, and started walking. At first, the trail was wide and smooth, an easy dirt path through thick woods. The ground was covered in leaves, damp from the night. I could hear birds, the wind moving softly through the branches, and the sound of my boots pressing into the soil. I felt good, strong, and excited. The trail began to climb. Slowly, the trees grew thinner, and I started getting glimpses of the ridges ahead. The hills looked steep and long, the kind of terrain that makes you question if you pack too much. My shoulders already ached under the weight of my backpack, but I kept pushing on. After an hour, I was sweating hard. The trail twisted upward, sometimes so steep I had to lean forward and place my hands on my knees as I climbed. My legs burned, but the higher I got, the more I could see. Looking back, I could see layers of trees stretching far out, the morning sun shining on them. Ahead, I saw a narrow ridge with sharp drop-offs on both sides. Crossing that ridge was the first time I felt nervous. The path was barely wide enough for my boots side by side. On one side was a steep drop into a valley covered in thick forest. On the other side, a sheer slope of loose rocks that seemed to run forever downward. The wind had picked up, not strong, but enough that I felt it pushing against me. I kept my eyes on the trail, moving slow, placing each step carefully. My heart pounded. When I finally reached the other side, the ridge opened back into forest, and I let out a long breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I kept walking deeper into the range. The trail dropped sharply into a dark valley, where the air grew cooler and damper. The ground was muddy, and I had to cross a small stream by stepping from rock to rock. I refilled one of my bottles with the water and used my filter. Then I started the long climb back up the next ridge. It was mid-morning now, and the sun was higher, hotter. Sweat soaked my shirt, and I could feel salt drying on my skin. The trail zigzagged upward endlessly. My calves screamed, and I stopped several times, leaning against trees, trying to catch my breath. By noon, I reached the top of the ridge. The view was incredible. Rolling hills, valleys, ridges stacked one after another, endless green stretching to the horizon. I sat down, ate some food, drank deeply, and let the wind cool my face. I felt strong again, proud of how far I had come. The trail along this ridge was easier, mostly flat. I made good time, but then it narrowed again, and the ground shifted to loose rock. The path was slanted slightly toward the drop, which made every step nerve-wracking. I forced myself to move slow, pressing the tips of my boots against solid rock whenever I could find it. My pack shifted on my back, throwing off my balance, and I had to fight to steady myself. My throat grew dry, and I realized how tense my body was, every muscle tight as I tried to stay steady. When the trail widened again, I collapsed to the ground for a minute, my whole body shaking. I checked my map. I had planned to reach a small clearing near a spring by evening to set up camp. I still had several miles to go. I stood up and kept walking, but the ridges seemed to stretch on forever. Each time I climbed one, another appeared ahead. The heat pressed down hard, and I drained my water faster than I expected. I filtered more when I found another small stream, but the water was slow-moving and murky. I hoped my filter was good enough. Late in the afternoon, clouds began to roll in. The light dimmed, and the air grew heavier. I heard thunder in the distance. I hurried, knowing storms could be dangerous on ridges. The trail led upward again, toward another narrow stretch. By the time I reached it, the sky had darkened, and the first drops of rain began to fall. The ridge was worse than the first. It was longer, narrower, and the drop-offs were sharper. The wind picked up fast as the storm moved in. Cold rain began to fall hard, soaking my clothes, making the rocks slick. Every step felt like it could be my last. The thunder cracked, and the sky flashed white. I was halfway across when a strong gust of wind slammed into me. My pack pulled me sideways, and my boots slipped on wet stone. My heart exploded with panic as I dropped to my knees and slammed my hands against the rock, my body leaning over the edge. The valley yawned below, dizzying. I pressed myself flat, chest against the ridge, breathing fast, terrified. It took everything I had to crawl back to my feet and inch forward. My hands shook, my legs felt weak, but I forced myself across, step by slow step. When I finally reached the end of the ridge and dropped into the safety of trees again, I collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath, my body trembling. The storm hammered the forest. Rain poured down in sheets, soaking everything. I pulled on my rain jacket, though it did little. The trail turned into a stream of mud and water. My boots sank deep, making every step harder. Branches whipped in the wind. The sky was almost black now, even though it was only evening. I had no choice but to keep moving. I had to reach the clearing by the spring. The storm made time drag. Every minute felt like 10. My shoulders ached so badly from the weight of my pack that I had to stop several times, dropping it to the ground, shaking out my arms, stretching my back. I was soaked, shivering, and exhausted. When I finally stumbled into the clearing, I nearly cried with relief. It was small, uneven, surrounded by thick trees. The spring was just a trickle of water running from rocks, but it was clean. I set my pack down, fumbling with numb hands to set up my tent. The ground was muddy, and the stakes wouldn't hold. The rain beat me down, turning the clearing into a swamp. I struggled for nearly an hour, fighting the wind, trying to keep the tent from collapsing. My hands were raw, my body shaking with cold. At last, I crawled inside, dragging my wet gear in with me. The floor was damp, but at least I was out of the wind and most of the rain. I changed into my dry clothes, shoving the wet ones into a corner. My body ached all over. I forced myself to cook a quick meal, but I barely tasted it. I was too tired. I lay down in my sleeping bag, listening to the storm rage outside. The sound of branches snapping in the wind made my stomach twist. I worried one would fall on my tent. Sleep came in short, broken bursts. I woke several times to the sound of thunder or heavy gusts of wind. My heart would pound, and it would take me minutes to calm down enough to drift off again. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside, but when I listened harder, it was only the rain and branches. By morning, the storm had passed. The clearing was a mess of mud and broken branches. My tent sagged, soaked through. I packed everything, my clothes still damp, my sleeping bag heavy with moisture. The sky was gray, and fog hung low between the trees. The trail ahead was rough. Mud sucked at my boots, and slippery rocks made every step dangerous. The fog was thick, hiding everything beyond a few yards. I felt trapped, alone in a gray world. My map told me I had about 10 miles left before the loop brought me back to the trailhead. It didn't sound like much, but after the storm, after the sleepless night, it felt like forever. Hours passed, each one heavier than the last. My body screamed with every step. My knees ached on the downhills, my lungs burned on the uphills. The ridge crossings were worse now with everything wet. I moved like a snail, terrified of slipping. My nerves were raw, my stomach tight with fear. I cursed myself for choosing this route, for thinking I could handle it alone. At one point, I slipped on a wet rock and fell hard, slamming my shin. Pain shot up my leg, and I cried out, clutching it. Blood trickled down into my boot. I sat there for a long time, shaking, fighting back panic. I cleaned it as best I could, wrapped it, and forced myself to keep moving, limping with